very happy that Ron is here, but he can't talk. So I am going to.
No, we're very happy that Ron is here. However.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Jen. Yes. I am rude enough to be an economist, but I only play one at seminar. And thank you, Jenna, for correcting my. I have the pleasure of introducing someone I just met. Aaron Chalfant is our guest speaker today. He's probably better known to many of you than to me. He's a PhD student in public policy, and is going to be talking to us today about a topic that many people have suspected that there is a problem with immigrants reducing wages of native workers, but very few people have any evidence on the subject, and so he's going to give us some evidence on the subject. So Aaron, we look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. Before I start, I'd like to just acknowledge my co-author, Morris Levy. Morris is a grad student over at Political Science, so he's here to answer any difficult questions that you ask of me. I'll punt to Morris. So this paper is our attempt to throw our hats into the ring and get involved with a sort of lengthy and maybe somewhat contentious literature. In particular, we're going to be concerned with the effect of immigration on labor market outcomes for U.S. natives. And in being even more specific, we're going to be thinking about Mexican immigrants. And I should note that the title right now is very, very long, and this is sort of reflective of the fact that we're going to try to cover a lot of ground with our identification strategy. So this is, as I've mentioned, it's a pretty large literature, and there's generally two approaches that people have taken to studying this question. And the first is an approach that's identified mostly with George Boras over at Harvard. And here the approach is structural. You posit a production function, you use national level data, and this approach tends to find large effects of immigration on natives' wages and employment. And a second approach that's mostly identified with David Card over here in the economics department. This is an approach where you study geographic regions in the United States, and you simply ask what happens to natives' wages when a city receives more immigrants. And so this debate, I think, still remains mostly unresolved. We are not going to resolve this particular debate for you today. In fact, we're not going to go anywhere near this particular debate. Instead, we're going to talk about a debate that we think is coming within this area studies literature. And to sort of set this up for you, the area studies literature tends to find these really small effects. If they're significant, they're small, and many times they're not differentiable from zero. But there is a recent paper written by Todd Kugach at Oregon State and Dean Yang at Michigan that uses rainfall variation, a very different source of identifying variation, to tease out an exogenous portion of immigration and look at the effect on wages. And they actually find pretty big effects. And their effects are on the same order of magnitude as the effects that are found in much of George Boras's work. And so what we're going to be doing for you today is we're going to use a third identification strategy, which we think is new in this literature. And we're going to report to you what we find using our identification strategy. And then maybe we will have a few comments at the end for what implications, if any, this has for this debate that might be brewing. So in this research that we're going to present to you today, we're using variation in lagged Mexican state-specific birth cohorts, the size of lagged birth cohorts. And we're going to leverage those data and also data on these network ties between different Mexican states and different US metro areas to predict immigration to the United States. We're going to then use that variation to tease out an effect on wages and employment as well. And we're going to look at natives in 4 skill groups, those with less than a high school degree, those with a high school education, those with some college, and those with college education or greater. To preview our findings, we actually come up with something that's much more similar to most of this literature that's David Card and co-authors, and somewhat dissimilar from this new working paper that uses rainfall. And what we find is that there's no effect on wages for natives in any of these skill groups. We find small effects. They're generally insignificant. It depends a little bit on how you weight up the cities on unemployment. And we actually do find some fairly robust evidence of some meaningful effects on the employment to population ratio among US natives, the proportion who are employed. So to motivate this for you a little bit, we want to consider the type of regression that we're interested in running in this literature. And here we're interested in running a regression of some labor market outcome. I'll generally just say the wage, but I mean the wage, the unemployment rate, and so on. We're interested in regressing the wage on the share of a city that's comprised of immigrants. And we'll throw in some city fixed effects and some year fixed effects, and that's the general model we're interested in estimating. Now, what people tend to do in this literature is use US Census data in long differences. You difference out this equation, you remove the fixed effects, and then you estimate model 2, in which you're regressing the change in the wage on the change in the immigrant share over 10 years. Of course, the assumption needed to identify this equation is that the immigrant share is, the covariance of the immigrant share in the error term is 0, and this is not going to be met if there's some time-varying variable that's omitted from the equation that predicts the wage and is related to immigration. It's also going to be violated if just as the immigrant share might predict the change in the change in the wage itself could be predicting the immigrant share. So what's been done in this literature is researchers use an instrumental variable. And this instrumental variable is something that's going to be correlated with the change in the immigrant share, but it's plausibly uncorrelated with everything else that you can think of, at least by assumption. And so there's been two primary strategies that have been employed to date. One is the strategy that I've mentioned to you, well, maybe I haven't mentioned so much, but we're going to refer to this as the network instrument. It's first proposed by Joseph Altanji and David Card in a 1991 article. I'll explain what that is for those of you who are unfamiliar. And this other approach, as I've mentioned, is using rainfall variation. So this network instrument, yep.
I'm sorry, this is a very foolish, naive question, but why are we interested in the effect of the share of immigrants on the wages rather than the effect of an additional immigrant?
Right, so
because the share of immigrants could go up if just a whole bunch of natives leave.
Right, so this is, okay, so that's a good point. So we can think about a percent change or a percentage point change. In this literature, we generally think about a percentage point change because we're interested in the composition, the change in the effect of the composition of the city on what happens to natives. And you can think about Mobile, Alabama. A 1 percentage point change would be a huge impact there, or 1% change, I should say, would be a small impact there. A 1% change would be a big change in the composition in Los Angeles. So trying to sort of put that on the same scale, this is the type of metric that's been used in this literature. But you're absolutely right that, in thinking about some of the underlying dynamics, maybe, as you sort of scale up and you reach a critical mass, the effects change. And that's a good point as well. We're just going to sort of stick to what's been done in the literature, but I acknowledge that that's a very good point. So what this network instrument is about is it's leveraging this empirical regularity about immigration. And that is the fact that immigrants from particular source regions tend to settle in destination regions in the US where there is already a community of immigrants from that source region. So for example, if I am an immigrant from Vietnam, there's a pretty good chance that I will settle in Houston, where there's already a large Vietnamese community. And this instrument, this strategy proposes that you can tease out good variation in the immigrant share, exogenous variation, by considering the total number of migrants from a particular source region in a particular year, and then some prior distribution of where migrants from that particular source region tend to go when they arrive in the United States. And formally, you can write this instrument down as follows. You can just multiply the change in the number of migrants from source region M, and in our research, we're going to be thinking about Mexican states, in time t, multiplied by p, which is going to be a set of weights that tell us where do people from each Mexican state go when they come to the US. And you sum that up over all the Mexican states, that gives you the predicted number of migrants. So, before I get to this actually, so the intuition here is that this instrument is living off the interaction between these two variables. And since p is something that's totally predetermined, doesn't depend on time, maybe we think this is a good approach because it shouldn't be correlated with anything that's time varying and omitted in our equation of interest, equation 2. So the network instrument, though, there are some potential issues with it, and this is, we're not by any means the first to point this out. This is pointed out by Altanji and Card themselves in their 1991 paper. It also appears, I think, in a footnote in every subsequent paper that David Card has written on the subject. And the problem is that we can get an inconsistent estimate of the effect of immigration when there's persistence in some labor market characteristic over time. In particular, we're thinking about something that draws migrants in a long time ago, continues to draw migrants in today. And you can think about the exclusion restriction being violated if there's differentially higher wage growth, say in gateway cities that tend to attract immigrants, and that this is a meaningful determinant of immigrant flows. And to nail this down, you can think that if immigrants respond to higher wages, this network instrument is going to mask an effect of immigration on the wages of US natives. It's going to give you an effect that is too small. So what can we do? Well, there's this new paper out that uses variation in rainfall. And the idea is that the network instrument is using only variation that pulls migrants, or at least mostly a variation that pulls migrants to a destination area. This rainfall instrument is relying much more on push variation that occurs out of the destination region, the source region. And so the idea here is they just modify the network instrument in the following way. They say instead of using the change in migrants, they're just going to use the amount of rainfall. And rainfall, they show, does tend to predict migration north to the United States. And again, they're going to interact it with some set of weights that tell us where people tend to go. So our strategy is a little bit different. We're using the size of black birth cohorts. And we're going to start by showing you the familiar network instrument in equation 5. This is exactly what I showed you a few slides ago. And we're going to note that we think P is pretty good, this matrix of weights that tells us where people go. With regard to Mexico, this is based on very, very long-standing migration networks which developed as long as a century ago. Some people have documented that these networks have sort of grown out of where railroad tracks have been placed in the 1910s and 20s. So we think P is maybe not so problematic. What we are a little bit more worried about, what Morris and I, what keeps us up at night, is that the change in the number of migrants from each source region each year, that's going to rely in part on what's going on in that Mexican state. It's also going to potentially be reliant on what's going on in linked US destinations. So this is going to be relying partially on this push variation, which we might like, and partially on this pull variation, which we worry a little bit more about. And we note that this term, the change in the number of migrants from each Mexican state each year, we can decompose this into two pieces. The first is going to be the number of migration-eligible births. So these are births that occurred a long time ago, which we deem are migration-eligible. In particular, we're going to be looking at people aged 17 to 52. This is when the vast number of people who migrate from Mexico migrate. And the other piece is this time-varying conditional probability of migration, particularly the conditional probability of migrating having been born in the first place. And so we sort of will make the case to you that this piece in the brackets, which is the piece that's the births, and let me just explain to you what that is. It's the births in each Mexican state in each year, summed over 17 to 52 years ago, summed over the 32 states in Mexico. We sort of think that that's good variation. It's something that happened a long time ago in Mexico. It's clearly, it shouldn't be responsive to what's going on in linked US cities many, many years later. We think the other piece is the bad variation because it responds potentially to what's going on in linked network cities. So what we do here in equation 7 is this is the same thing as this network instrument, except we're now interacting the set of weights P with this decomposed this decomposition. So we call the decomposition is the same thing as the change in number of migrants. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to want to get rid of that portion that we don't like, the conditional probability of migration, and create an instrumental variable that we're showing in equation 8. And in 8, we're just interacting these migration weights with the number of migration-eligible births, and we're just going to scale that by the labor force size in some predetermined year with respect to our analysis, which is going to be 1980. And the reason we do that is because it's going to be the case that it's very easy to affect the Mexican share in Abilene, Texas. It's going to be much harder to affect the Mexican share in Los Angeles. So, as we've mentioned, there's discrepancies between the two instrumental variables approaches in this literature. The network instrument tends to find these small effects. The rainfall instrument finds these large effects. And Pugac and Yang, who are the authors of this rainfall paper, in the conclusion of their paper, they sort of make the case, well, we think there is persistence in these wage shocks that draw migrants to US cities, and therefore we think that this network instrument is giving us an answer that's too small. The rainfall instrument is more plausibly exogenous. We get an estimate closer to those that are associated with George Borjas, and that is maybe the answer. And Morris and I just want to point out that there could be a number of other explanations for this. So the first is that these two instrumental variable strategies could be identifying different local average treatment effects. So for example, when we think about this network instrument, maybe we're thinking in part about economic migrants, but in part about migrants who come for family reunification reasons. And maybe when we think about migrants who move because of rainfall, we're thinking about short-term economic migration, and maybe those two sets of migrants have different effects. There's also this issue where Pugac and Yang actually look at this at the state level, the level of the U.S. state. All the other literature looks at the level of the MSA, and that could certainly be driving some differences. And then the one that Morris and I are sort of most interested in, I think, right now, is the fact that this rainfall instrument uses annual data. We're talking about short-term shocks due to rainfall. And there might be very different effects in the short run and the long run from immigration. In particular, it could be that there is some kind of long-run adjustment process. And so there's no reason that those two strategies would have to give you the same answer, even if those strategies are plausible instruments.
So let me just ask a quick question. So you gave the two economic stories for the card instrument and this Pugac and Yang. So what's your economic story?
Your timing is, I think, absolutely impeccable. So I'm about to get to that on this slide. So the intuition behind this identification strategy is that historical birth cohorts isolate. It's like running an experiment where you could assign a different number of immigrants to each city in each 10-year period, over each 10-year period. And we think that there's two potential ways in which two mechanisms as to why this incremental variable strategy works. One effect is quite mechanical. If there's more Mexicans aged 17 to 52, there's simply more that can migrate, a very mechanical effect. And this is something that's shown up in some work by Gordon Hanson and Craig McIntosh in I think it's a 2008 paper. There's also potentially a behavioral effect, and this is also documented in that paper I just mentioned. And in particular, Hanson and McIntosh document that when there's a larger birth cohort, that can perturb the labor market in Mexico and push some people north, that maybe there's a short-run dearth in supply of jobs or something like that.
So does it worry you that larger birth cohorts might be born in times when things were going better for their parents? And so as a consequence, you're looking at yet a different local average treatment effect, which is sort of a different quality of immigrant on average.
So I think that's likely to be true. I mean, there is definitely some evidence that fertility can change in response to economic patterns. We're going to think of that potentially, though, as good variation, since it's also push variation. Now, in terms of the underlying mechanism, you're right. It sort of might be just another way in which birth cohorts operate. But we're going to think of anything that's pushing migrants out of Mexico as being potentially good variation, and things that are pulling them in as variation that's a little more worrisome. So again, our strategy is going to be to partial this network instrument into two components. One that's explained by births, and the other that's explained by stuff other than births. And some of this could be things like what's going on in Mexico, economic variation in Mexico. Some of this is going to be things that potentially are drawing migrants in the US. And a natural question to ask is how much of this, how is this decomposed? And when you regress the network instrument on our birth cohorts instrument, about half the variation is explained by births, and the other half is not shared variation at all. So that gives you a sense that the births really do matter in some respect.
Aaron, also, I think in here is a bit of internal Mexican migration, right? So that in the Altangian card, a person who leaves home at 17 and moves to another Mexican state basically takes their identifying leverage with them, whereas in your strategy, it always remains in their hometown.
Right, so that's a good point, and what we do is, and I'll get to this maybe in 5 minutes, but let me just preview this for you now, because I think that's a timely question, is we're going to look at the state of birth in Mexico. We acknowledge that people might move around, but we're going to look at where people who are born in a certain Mexican state tend to go in the U.S. To the extent that they might migrate within Mexico, that's just going to make it harder for us to find a first stage. So if we do find a first stage, and I'll tell you that I think we do, maybe I'll just say that's more power to us, but that's definitely going on, I think. So I want to give you a sense, and I realize this is probably too much to see on one slide. So let me walk you through what we're doing here, because we're using these 10-year differences, right? Because we're using census data, and we're using these long birth windows. So it actually becomes potentially a little bit confusing to think about where the identifying variation comes from. And it's going to derive from the fact that different states experience the peaks of their number of births at different times. And let me just walk you through the steps, and hopefully it'll make sense at the end. So if you let B be each city's potential migrant pool in year T. So in Los Angeles, there might be 3 million potential Mexican migrants who are network-linked Mexican states who could move to Los Angeles. And we're going to think of this, we're going to only look at male migration. So we're going to think of this as the number of male births between 17 and 52 years ago. And this is in keeping with how I'll set up the instrument. And now if we think about B in the year T minus 10, that's going to be births that were born 27 to 62 years ago. And so our instrument for the change in migration over this 10-year period is going to be B in time T minus B in time T minus 10. And when you just do some rearranging, what you find is that this is going to be the number of births in City I's network-linked Mexican states that occurred between 17 and 26 years ago, minus those that occurred between 53 and 62 years ago. So we're actually not using variation in every single year. We're using variation only in specific time intervals. And let me convince you now, hopefully convince you now, that there is some meaningful variation within these time intervals. So what I'm showing you here are 6 of the largest sending states, Mexican sending states to the US. These states account for a really, really large share of what's going on. And what I'm showing you here is for 1990 and 2000, the number of migration-eligible births that come from each of these states. And so if we look at Jalisco, for example, in 1990, there were about 450,000 migration-eligible births that occurred within the window that I've told you about. And by 2000, that's gone up to 500,000. If you look at Zacatecas, the story is really, really dissimilar, right? It's gone down by quite a bit. And so the intuition here would be that US destinations that are relying heavily on Jalisco should see some of the larger increases in Mexican immigration, and those which are relying more on Zacatecas should receive either maybe declines in immigration or maybe at least smaller increases. So how are we estimating this? Well, in the first stage, we're going to regress the change in the immigrant share on this instrument that I've told you about. The outcome equation, we're going to use the predicted change in immigrant share to study the effect on these outcome variables. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with these outcome variables. So you'll note that we're using first differences or long differences. We're including a year fixed effect. But we also want to control for changes in the composition of cities. Because it could be that independently of any of that, there's just some movement going on that we might care about. So what we do is we follow a strategy that is introduced in Altanji and Card in 1991, and we parcel out variation in the change in, say, the wage that's explained by changes in city composition. And we follow the following approach. We simply let X be some demographic variables. For us, they're going to be age, race, and education. What we're going to do is we're going to interact these flexibly. We're going to enter some square terms in, and then using the individual level census data, so these are individual people, for each of our census years, we're going to regress Y on X and a vector of city fixed effects. And the interpretation on the coefficient for each of those city fixed effects is going to be the wage in that city after accounting for these compositional effects. And so we're not relying solely on these long differences, we're also parceling some other stuff out. Yeah, Mark.
Is there a chance there's a relationship between the birth cohort size in Mexico and the destination city birth cohort relationship?
That's something we might want to investigate some more. So I can tell you that there's, we'd be thinking about, again, these are lagged births. So, oh, you're saying in the same year.
Especially if they're near the border, you might think that
Yeah, no, that potentially could be going on. One thing we know is that economic linkages between these states, like, for example, when the economy is good in a particular Mexican state, it doesn't seem to affect the economy in the linked U.S. destinations. So there wouldn't be that type of linkage, but whether there'd be some kind of more direct linkage, I think is something we should investigate.
Are these city-to-city sort of migration patterns fairly fixed? I mean, I'm wondering if there's a decrease in a birth cohort in Jalisco and they intend to go to El Paso, if Mexican immigrants from other cities then realize that there's a,
So, are they fixed? The short answer would be no. Of recent, there's actually been a lot of change. Immigrants who used to follow these pathways very closely are now going to lots of new places: North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, places you never would have thought of 2 decades ago. Now we're going to actually use weights, these weights that are going to be predetermined with respect to our analysis. Now, the other half of your question might address whether they're fixed even between, say, 1920 and 1980. The short answer is it's not really easy to answer that because cell sizes get really low when you try to decompose this over time. We're going to aggregate up and just tease out the permanent component of these weights. But there is potential for these weights to evolve a little bit over time. I can tell you that if you look at where people go in 1980, for example, though, it's amazing how well you can predict immigration using these network link pathways. People in 1980 are really, really following these pathways very strongly. And I will also tell you that our analysis is going to use the years 1980 to 2000. We wanted to include data from 2010. As it turns out, this network instrument no longer has enough bite in 2010. So, it's just reflective of some I think, rather recent broad changes in where these migrants go. So the data come, as I've mentioned, from the U.S. Census. And we also have annual data on births in Mexico. And I confess I don't speak Spanish. I'm not going to try to pronounce this for you. But Morris, is there anything you want to say about this data source? Anything particular? No? Okay. So this is some data that we have not seen used in this literature before. It tells you how many births occurred in each Mexican state in each year. There is a little bit of measurement error in these data, so there are a few people who will register a birth maybe a year or two after the birth occurred. Now, we're using these really, really long windows, so we're not so worried about that. And I think it's right that about 80% of the births are registered as far as we can tell in the right year. So just a caveat, but not something we worry so much about. Now let me tell you a little bit about where we get these weights P, where people go from which Mexican states, where do people go in the US from a given Mexican state. So the data that we use is from the Mexican Migration Project. This is a joint venture between Princeton University and University of Guadalajara. And what the Mexican Migration Project has done is they've gone into communities in Mexico and they've sampled people at random and said, hey, have you ever migrated to the United States for the purposes of living there? And about 20% of male households say, yes, I have migrated to the United States. And if they say yes to that question, the MMP simply asks, well, where did you go? And they ask, where did you go the first time, the second time, the third time, and so on. As it turns out, it's there. No matter what migration episode we choose, we get really the same set of weights. We choose the first one. But 9 out of 10 of these guys are undocumented. So the other thing I want to flag for you is I think we're going to be able to capture migration networks that are maybe even more specific to undocumented immigrants. And that might be of particular interest in some of these policy debates where people worry about undocumented immigrants taking jobs from Americans.
Sorry, so you're measuring the migration by looking at return migration?
Oh, okay. So pretty much that's right. So these are people who are back in Mexico who have returned. That's absolutely right. Is that potentially going to capture different network linkages than people who stay? Potentially, but we've done a little bit of digging, and it seems like these are things that really were set by the placement of railroads, by networks that were started a long time ago. So, but that's a good point. So we're going to drop from the analysis anyone who migrated after 1979. The reason we do this is because we want these weights to be strictly predetermined with respect to our analysis, which begins in 1980. And here what I want to do, and I hope you guys can see this, especially in the back, is I want to sort of open up this matrix P that I keep talking about and give you a sense that P is sort of sensible. So what I'm showing you is for each Mexican state, I'm showing you the top 3 US destinations. And I want to begin by flagging Baja California del Norte. This is the second one from the top. This is the Mexican state that is just south of San Diego. It's home to Tijuana. And here you see a remarkably high percentage of these folks end up in San Diego. On the other hand, if you look at Nuevo León, which is a state in eastern Mexico, These guys are ending up in cities in Texas, Houston, Dallas, and McAllen. And being originally from New York City, I can't help to point this out, that a very large percentage of folks in Puebla end up in New York, which, as someone from New York can tell you, is just totally true. There it is. And I can also slice this matrix a little bit differently. And here I'm going to show you some of the biggest MSAs that in the sample, and I'll show you for each of those MSAs the 3 biggest Mexican sending regions. And this is just to show you that there is some meaningful variation in where people come from. In general, it seems to be the case that Jalisco is an important sending city for California, and Durango, Guanajuato, some other states for cities in the Midwest and Texas. So now I want to get to my results, and how am I doing on time? Does anyone?
We've got about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes, perfect. Okay, I might even finish.
And then, and then we're going to hold you longer with regular Q&A.
Perfect. Well, I think timing's good. So I want to begin by showing you our first stage results to show you that in fact these births in network-linked states do predict migration to network-linked cities. And let me start by just introducing to you the general format of this table, because all of the results tables are going to follow the same format. So here in columns 1 and 2, we're looking at cross-sectional regression. These are long differences from 1980 to 1990. Columns 3 and 4 from 1990 to 2000. And columns 5 and 6 use all 3 census years. In columns 1, 3, and 5, we're not going to weight the data at all. We're just going to say each city receives the same weight in the analysis. In columns 2, 4, and 6, we're going to weight by the 1980 MSA population. So now let me interpret these coefficients for you. So recall that the way I've scaled this instrument, the way we've scaled this instrument, is that we've divided by the labor force size. And that's going to be in both sides of the equation. The immigrant share as a function of labor force, and the number of migration eligible births as a function of labor force. So the way you can interpret these, say looking at column 1, is that about 9% of Mexican immigrants end up in this time period in a network-linked US city. And if you look at 1990-2000, that number is more like 4 or 5%. And these are actually fairly sensible, because we know about a fifth of Mexican males tend to migrate to the US at some point. So this is just, and the difference in 1980 and 1990, I also want to say that's not reflective of the fact that there's a lower migration rate. That ends up being mostly reflective of the fact that these network weights tend to become less important over time. So there's just as much migration, maybe even more so, but these are folks going, in some sense, to some new destinations.
So I'm sorry, could you just repeat first, what's the dependent variable here?
The dependent variable is going to be the immigrant share, the share of immigrants as the number of immigrants divided by the labor force size. The labor force size in a predetermined year.
And that's taken from the U.S. Census?
Taken from the U.S. Census.
So it's really not necessarily capturing documents. Well, to the extent that census captures them, it does. To the extent it
Yeah,
doesn't,
I mean, there could be some measurement error in that. Now, here, that's going to be the dependent variable, so we're not going to worry about that so much. As it turns out, we can get a sense of how bad the measurement error is, because we have the CPS and the American Community Survey that are available annually. And it does turn out that there is some measurement error, but you'd have to believe that measurement error was sort of non-random, and non-random in such a way that it still affects the immigrant share conditional upon the differencing, conditional upon the year fixed effects. But I mean, it's true, we're not going to be able to exactly capture the number of immigrants. This is, I think, just an issue with this sort of literature. And I want to point out to you before I move on the R-squared values in this table. And often people don't point out to you R-squared values, but I think actually here it's sort of interesting. So if you look at the 1980 to 1990 analysis, R-squared in the weighted models in column 2 is 64%. So actually, we're explaining a lot of variation in immigrant share using our instrument. And that might give you some intuition that even least squares might not be so bad in this particular time period. Now, by 1990 to 2000, we're explaining much less. And overall, we're explaining about 40% of the variation. Now, the other reason that's potentially important is because when you think about rainfall, you could be teasing out a pretty narrow local average treatment effect. But we're actually, we think, documenting something that captures a lot of the variation in immigration. This is, I think, a broad-based local average treatment effect. So now what I want to show you is our first set of results. And let me walk you through what we're doing here. So it's the same table format in terms of the columns. In panel A, we're showing you least squares models. In panel B, we're showing you the instrumental variables estimates. And what you notice here is, of course, in the 1980 and 1990 sample, the estimates look pretty similar, and that's reflective of the fact that this instrument is capturing so much of the variation. There are some important differences in 1990 to 2000. And so in 1990 to 2000, in the least squares models, you see a lot of evidence that it looks like where there's more immigrants, there's a bigger change in the wage. Now, there are lots of reasons to think that there's some selection going on, which is why we instrument in the first place. And actually, when you instrument, those numbers generally turn negative. They're not significant, but perhaps that is evidence of some important selection. Now, if you look at column 6, this is the column that we're mostly going to be interested in interpreting because it uses all of the data, and it's weighting the cities by MSA to sort of come up with a national effect. And here you see really no evidence that wages are affected in any way by Mexican immigrants. And to interpret this, if you look at the less than high school row under panel B in column 6, a 1 percentage point increase in the Mexican share is going to be lead to a 0.08% decline in the wage. That's a really, really small number. The standard error is obviously much bigger, but even ignoring the standard error, that's a really small effect. Now I'm showing you the same table, except we're looking at unemployment rates. And here you see maybe that when you look across all these columns, the numbers do tend to be positive. And so there's perhaps a sense in which unemployment rates might have risen a little bit due to Mexican immigration. However, when you look at columns 5 and 6, you only see one effect that rises to the level of statistical significance. This is the weighted model for high school labor. Now, when you don't weight the model, it's not quite significant anymore, so it's not really a terribly robust effect. What we'll say about this, though, is that when you think about a 1 percentage point increase in the Mexican share, that's not that small an increase, actually. For many, many cities, that's a pretty big increase over a decade. And we might think about a huge increase being 4 percentage points in a decade. So if you multiply that coefficient of about 0.3 by 4, that would suggest that even a very large change in the Mexican share would only be associated with an increase in the unemployment rate for high school labor of about 1.2%.
Is the unemployment rate only the unemployment rate of the native born?
Yes, we've gotten, only the native one. That's right. We're not including prior migrants. And then finally, I'll show you some results that we do find a little bit more robust evidence of effect. And this is the employment to population ratio. And here, what we find, if you look at column 6 again, is 1 percentage point increase in the Mexican share leads to a negative 0.56 percentage point decrease in the employment rate for natives with less than a high school degree, and a negative 0.3 percentage point decrease for natives with a high school degree, although that is not significant when you weight it, is significant when you don't weight. And how economically meaningful is this? Well, if you look at the overall decline in the employment rate for people with less than a high school degree from 1980 to 2000, our best guess is that Mexican immigration might explain about 20% of that decline. So this is, it's not an enormous effect, but it's perhaps economically meaningful.
Supposing there's those people who left the labor market with zero wage, what happens to your wage?
Well, yeah, and that's getting back to the wage numbers. That's always going to be an issue in these data, that there might be some, selection in and out of labor markets. With regard to just people who are employed at all, I don't think there's going to be a major problem. But you're right about the wage, and this is just one of these caveats that everyone who writes this paper sort of has to, footnote. And I want to show you one more table, and before I show you actually. So we've been talking about this network instrument and partialing out variation in the network instrument that we think of as being good variation. And so a natural comparison is, would the network instrument have given us a different answer? And the question we're really getting at, I guess, with this is the network instrument good? Are all these papers that have been written using the network instrument, and there have been many, is this a valid strategy at all? Or maybe are Pugac and Yang right, we should really be looking at something like rainfall? As it turns out, when you do this exercise, you get remarkably similar answers. No effect for the wage. The unemployment numbers look very similar. Employment looks unbelievably similar. In fact, there's an asterisk missing from column 6, and you can see how similar those estimates are. And this is despite the fact that half of the variation is unshared between our instrument and the network instrument. And our sense here, then, is just to sort of wrap up, is that the network instrument, at least with these dependent variables, and at least for long differences, the network instrument looks pretty good. And so if we're trying to resolve this debate about push versus pull variation and rainfall and the network instrument, maybe it's right that differences between this rainfall paper and this network instrument paper are more likely due to the fact that they use different cross-sectional units, maybe a different local average treatment effect, or a different short and long run effect of immigration. And this is something Morris and I can definitely push forward on. One thing we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to re-estimate this rainfall paper using MSAs rather than states and see if the level of aggregation is at work here. Basically the bottom line conclusion is maybe the network instrument's good after all. So that's all I have, and I'm very happy to take your questions and hear your comments.
Thank you. I thought this was fascinating and very carefully done. If I understood what you were saying, though, the dependent variable in the when you finally got to it was what was left over, the residual from a wage equation. Is there much left over after you account for all that? And if there isn't very much, does that put an upper bound on how much of an effect you can find?
So as it turns out, a lot of it's left over. As it turns out, those flexibly estimated demographic variables explain, depending on the dependent variable, about 20% of what you see.
How much?
20%.
So there's still lots.
There's still a lot to
unemployment,
explain.
Lots of wage
Yeah.
left.
I was surprised myself.
So some of the literature tries to look at the effect of recent immigrants on either native-born Hispanics or prior immigrants. Like you could get that by looking at people who've been in the census 5 years earlier. Did you get that though?
We haven't yet. It's definitely on our list. The way we structured our paper is to remain broadly similar to both to these David Card papers and also to this Pugac and Yang paper. So we sort of wanted to make what we did comparable, but we definitely want to push on that because I think some of the findings from that early literature is that it doesn't affect natives so much, but it does affect prior migrants. So it's something we want to
The
push
traction
on.
you're getting is on, if there is some, is on unemployment.
Right,
And
right.
one last thing, was that male employment?
Oh yeah, I think I probably didn't say this, and this was important to say. These are only males, male migrants and male natives. So we could certainly think about female migration as well. We've limited it to males just to remain consistent with this recent paper that doesn't look at females at all. But it's another area we can push on.
So just to return to the return migration measurement, so there's some work recently that's kind of showing that return migration is a really important part of explaining migrant outcomes. So migrants look like they do better than natives once you control for a lot of education and background things, but that result appears to be because the worse off migrants tend to return migrate. I think that you're on the right track in terms of linking the Mexican census data, but I think you need to be careful that the return migration is not endogenous to the success of the migrant in the city that they went to.
Yeah, so we're only capturing people who migrate along network linkages, first of all. But no, your point addresses something more broad than that. What I would say is we're going to be capturing something that has to do with people being pushed out of Mexico, and potentially there are people who leave as well. But we're isolating variation that is explained by births a long time ago. So the local average treatment effect is going to be people who are pushed out by births. Now, could some return migrants also be pushed back due to lagged births in Mexico? I'm sure we could think about a story like that. I think we probably could, but yeah.
I have another question about, I don't know how well you can get this at the MSA level, but I think that people are always interested in internal migration that occurs as a response to this. Is there anything you can say about that?
So there is this 2001 David Card paper where he looks and sees whether natives tend to move around to different cities in response to immigrants moving in. He finds no evidence. For now, we're sort of resting on that finding that everyone seems to rest on and saying, there's no problem. That said, I think we can do some of our own analysis and see if it holds up year over year over this entire time period. But
So I'm wondering about your push and pull analogy that you're working with. I mean, it seems like it's more a delta that you're interested in because it seems like depending on what's going on in the state of Mexico versus what's going on in the United States, it's really the delta that drives that equation. It's not one or the other. I mean, if you have high wages in Mexico and high wages in the United States, it's not going to be at the end of the draws when you have low. And if you have really depressed wages or not much jobs, and people are going to migrate back, there's more employment. I mean, it seems like it's a delta instead of a.
Well, so, but again, the local average treatment effect we're going to tease out is that which is explained by births. And I think the problematic portion of that delta migration is, I think the portion you're referring to is the conditional probability of migrating from a given Mexican state in a given year. And that portion, I totally agree with you, is going to depend both on what's happening in Mexico and what's happening in the United States. So there's some push in there and there's some pull in there. And because we can't really discern how much is push and how much is pull, we're going to discard that piece and stick to only the portion that's explained by births, which we think of as more plausibly being related to push rather than pull variation. Does that answer your question? Justin?
So I think you said that you thought about using the 2010 census, but then decided not to. I think you said because you had a week per stage, your instrument wasn't working out as you would have hoped. So can you say a little bit about what that means for kind of current trends, and does that mean that these relationships don't necessarily really apply to?
So what this means is anyone who is interested in studying the effect of Mexican immigration, in particular, using these differences in this Mexican state type variation, pushing forward might have to find a different identification strategy. Now, when we're thinking about migrants from different regions of the entire world, it may be that these network linkages are still fairly strong. But what this really reflects is this amazing shift in where migrants are going. I mean, in 1980, it's unbelievable how powerful these instruments are. And currently, the states that are receiving the most growth in immigrants are states that had like the lowest Mexican shares in 1980, like Alabama and Georgia and North Carolina. And actually, California is not experiencing much growth at all. And another sort of point to bring up about Mexican immigration today is that we've sort of reached a local minimum, so to speak. That there's been a lot of decline in migration from Mexico to the United States in the last couple of years, and more return migration. This is in large part obviously due to the economy in the United States right now, the state of the economy. It also could be due to the fact that fertility in Mexico has declined a great deal. So it's very likely that these huge numbers of Mexican immigrants who came in the 80s and 90s, that might not be likely to continue. These are based on cohorts where the average woman had about 5 children. And now I believe the average woman in Mexico has more like 2.4 children. I think that's about right. Okay, someone says that's right. So we probably should expect there to be less Mexican immigration in the future. Now, that being said, I'll throw one more thing out there. There's a recent Pew survey of folks living in Mexico, and these guys were asked, how many of you would be living in the United States right now if you could? And 36% actually said yes. So despite the fact that there's these declining fertility rates and some return migration, less migration now because of the economy, I think there still is, there are some forces in Mexico that are going to keep pushing people here. So the long version of the answer you're looking for, I think.
Probably as long as we send them guns, they will send us people.
Fair enough. that might be a good trade, you know? Yeah.
Have you looked at your outcome variables by race and ethnicity, or then say?
So we initially did, and then we realized, boy, these data can get pretty noisy, even looking at the census. I think we can probably break these out by race, in particular to do the analysis that was suggested over here to look at prior to migrants. And when we did that, we didn't find any particular, we looked at blacks and whites, we didn't find any particularly strong effects on blacks and whites. That said, there's more noise in the data, so it becomes harder and harder to reject some of these effects. I think it's something we're going to want to push on a little bit. I'm not sure where it ends up in the paper. It might be an appendix or something, but yeah, it's something we've thought about, and we probably will do a little bit more of in the future. Yep.
Well, 80% of the migration can be predicted by your birth cohort.
So overall about 40%.
Oh, 40%?
Yeah.
Well, then there's other portion that can't be.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering how sensitive that is to economic variables. If there's a boom in the chicken plucking industry in Alabama, then people say, well, I would be going to Houston, but get a better deal in Alabama.
So there's this, I think, really, really good paper by Brian Cadena and Brian Kovac, University of Colorado and Carnegie Mellon, respectively. I don't know if it's published yet, but it's definitely in working paper form. And they actually document pretty strong migrant flows in response to industry-specific shocks in U.S. cities. So this is definitely going on. And this is one of the reasons that motivated us to want to throw out that piece of variation that depended on the conditional probability of migrating in a given year. We think that births, teasing out the variation due to births, is going to rid ourselves, is going to purge ourselves from that kind of variation. But as just a point of interest, why do people go and where? It's absolutely right that people in Mexico are very, very sensitive to what's going on in local labor markets here. And it's actually fascinating how good the information they have must be. To know that there are, say meat processing plants opening up in Columbus, Ohio, and I have a cousin who went there, he got a job, I'm going to go get a job too. So it's just amazing how much information these folks must have, I think.
And you're not worried so much about the depressing effect on wages in a boom city. In fact, you would like having migrants come in and damp the rise in wages to keep the boom going.
I guess it depends on who you are, if you're a worker or an employer. I think, yeah, certainly, if I run a meat packing plant, I'm very happy when the wage goes down.
No, not go down, just doesn't rise as fast.
Or doesn't rise as fast. And it's certainly right, but we're interested in sort of teasing out a causal effect on wages, so we're going to sort of throw out that variation, only look at variation that's predicted by births. But I think there's lots of fascinating sort of correlational things that you can find that would be really, really interesting, things along those lines. Ron asked, the timing of birth changes is tied to the timing of fertility transition, and might areas with more rising births also be lower education and poorer? And how would this affect our results? That's a good question. So there's an underlying assumption here that a migrant from each state in Mexico is sort of equivalent that we're making. And it's very possible that the birth cohorts are pushing out different types of migrants from different states. If that's true, then our local average treatment effect is just going to be a weighted average of a bunch of others. And it's going to be hard for us to disaggregate that, given that we only have about 75 MSAs in 32 Mexican states.
And then just jump in and say, kind of the 6 leading Mexican sending states, which we showed on that graph, are not all in the exact same region, but have fairly similar profiles. Michoacan is a little bit poorer, some of them are a little bit wealthier, but those 6 states themselves show dramatically different patterns of large birth cohorts followed by small birth cohorts of the opposite. So you may be right, but that's at least not the whole story as far as what's driving this.
Yep.
Yeah, your migration patterns, they're identified by data from the 70s, right? Does that explain why they decline?
So it's identified partially on data from 1928 to 38 and partially on data from 1963 to 73. It's going to be the difference between those two things. Basically, it's not going to depend on anything that's happening in the 1940s or 1950s. It's going to be very specific to what's happening in those years, and that's just the variation we're going to be able to leverage. And if there were no variation in those years, we'd be sort of out of luck. When you regress the network instrument on the birth instrument, the amount explained would be more like 90% rather than 50%.
Yeah, I mean, if you might be able to identify more recent migration patterns,
Yeah.
maybe you could use it in the future.
So, again, we would have gone to 2010. As it turns out, this network instrument just becomes weak when you add in 2010, and that's the reason we haven't gone more recent, because we don't feel like we would be reporting something faithful to you using 2010. But certainly it would be very interesting to see how this works out going forward if someone could figure out a way to find a non-weak instrument with this type of strategy.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Aaron. And Dino has an announcement about an
Now you
event
can
next
just look up.
Wednesday.
Is on next week at, in the public policy school, and you're all welcome to.
Maybe something you guys haven't seen.